Well, hello everybody. Welcome into Great Atmosphere here on January 31st of 2024. Today I wanted to get started by looking at our big low pressure system that is circulating off of the Cascadian coastline. This is what we refer to in the business as the Pineapple Express. Now, you might know about the movie and the subsequent drug-related themes that come with the Pineapple Express, but here in the meteorological world, that's just our way of kind of denoting this line coming from the coming from the Hawaiian archipelago that comes all the way up, and essentially it's just a giant ridge or a giant just streamline of moisture that makes its way all the way from Hawaii to the west coast of the U.S. by way of these big low pressure centers as they begin to occlude and spin around themselves. And this is precipitable water, so this is kind of like showing just how much moisture is in each square or every cubic meter of the atmosphere. Obviously, if you get up into these oranges and reds and greens, there's much more moisture than in your purples and reds in this particular scenario, and that just kind of simulates just how much moisture it's drawing from the very moist and warm equatorward tropical regions that the Hawaiian archipelago is consistently experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And we can actually see just how cool this system looks if we take a look at the SatLab Sierra at Colorado State has put together a series of images that certainly are quite mesmerizing if you take a look at it. In terms of, these are like satellite infrared imagery. This is the GOES 18 view of just the air mass fumes that come off of the giant clouds, and look at the dry slot going all the way in and around inside of this cyclone. Now, of course, this looks like a hurricane to a layperson, but it's not a hurricane. This is just a very, very strong mid-latitude low pressure system. Ultimately, the difference being that this is an interaction between warm and cold air, the warm air being invected in from the tropics, mixing in with dry cold air from the surface, and it all gets wrapped up together as the low center starts to move further and further to the northern latitudes. But the end result, ultimately, if you put everything in terms of severe parameters, we get gale force winds out here. There's some models that are saying that winds are exceeding over 74 miles an hour, so that would be hurricane force strength winds. So I mean, a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. If it's all the same to you, you could say that's a hurricane. But from a strictly meteorological definition point of view, it is not. It is just an incredibly powerful low pressure cyclone. And just look at you can see the different layers of the atmosphere, just how big that cloud deck is. You can see the surface level features here, and then you can see that big wall of moisture as it just hits the continental air mass. Really, really cool stuff that Sierra's put out. And even better of the true color and infrared right here from earlier in the day. And we have a little bit of seeing that low pressure system begin to tighten as it makes its northern path. So really, really cool stuff. Just an incredible show of just how powerful these systems are, and they're beautiful, just absolutely beautiful systems. We'll take a look at what it looks like currently. It's starting to get stretched out a little bit in the vertical, and that might be more attributed to the flat imagery of this particular Mercator projection satellite. But ultimately, the main driver of the weather is this eastward facing side of the low pressure system that is literally going along a meridional or vertical on a Cartesian plane trajectory that is just drawing up all this moisture and is just dumping it over Northern California and points northward, pretty much going into today. And then, gradually speaking, this low will start to merge with the upper level jet that we'll take a look at here in a second, which will start to make its way further to the south in terms of its impacts and begin to dump perhaps even 6 feet of snow over the Sierra Nevada. So quite an interesting setup for sure. We'll take a look at our all hazards indicators by the National Weather Service, and you can see for the majority of the rest of the United States, just some flood warnings from previous rainmakers that have occurred over the past week or so over the southern Mississippi River Valley. And really, there's not much else to talk about beyond this giant atmospheric river event, this Pineapple Express event that is going to be impacting the West Coast. See winter storm warnings all up in the upper elevations and behind. And then we have flood advisories in Southern California and points northward in the San Francisco areas and points north in Napa Valley, and also significant high wind advisories as well. So quite the significant system that the West Coast is dealing with. It'll be interesting to see what the ultimate results play out. Now, this is nothing that's going to be, biblical or anything like that, like some people have ascribed it to be, but ultimately, it's still going to be a highly impactful event. This is the West Coast's typical rainy season, so ultimately, they need to get as much of this precipitation in as they can and fill up those reservoirs before the dry late spring, summer months come in which they sometimes don't even get they get less than an inch of rain the entire time. So it's good that they're getting this snowpack in now, rather than just not having it at all, and they start getting dried out. And we can see that system start to move in on the radar reflectivity on the national scale. Our low pressure system that we dealt with yesterday is slowly meandering off of the Carolina coast with some lingering showers and coming through the portions of the coastal plain and Piedmont of North Carolina. But ultimately, this is the main driver, and you can see that this Northern California is getting currently just trained over and over again with these very torrential rain showers. Nothing in the ways of severe weather, no tornadic activity or anything like that. It's just a good amount of precipitation. So, excuse me. That'll be the story for the West Coast here for the next few days. So we'll take a look at what the current temperatures look like, and I could refresh the page just to make sure that we're getting the right look. Looks about mid-50s across most of the southeast at the moment. This is definitely more in the mild climatological range, but ultimately the main story as far as temperature-wise is here in the northern plains. For the northern plains to be around in the upper 40s around this time of year, they're typically in that north central plains region, we typically experience temperatures maybe just touching freezing at 32 degrees, but typically in the high 20s around this time of year here in late January. And to see some of these values here in the Black Hills, specifically South Dakota, 62 degrees, that's ridiculous heat. That is quite anomalous, and you can actually see that anomaly quite loud and clear here in the temperature anomaly day 0 through 5 forecast here by the Euro. Some of these, especially in the Canadian prairies, I mean, these values are off the chart, and I'm sure that, it says 20 degrees above normal. I'm sure there's areas in here, specifically in Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan, that are well over 40 degrees above normal for this time of year. And ultimately, yeah, I mean, they might be experiencing some great mild weather here in January, and that can be great in and of itself, but the main thing that worries me specifically about that is wildfires, because whenever we don't get a good amount of snowpack or a significant freeze that shuts down the Canadian growing season a little bit more of an extended period of time, that just gives the opportunity for more growth to occur than would otherwise occur on a normal annual basis, and there's just going to be a lot of vegetation. And that might seem like a good thing as well, but I mean, with the climate extremes that we've seen in recent years, and for anyone that's lived on the East Coast of the U.S. specifically, we've experienced quite a bit of wildfire smoke issues across the majority, and air quality issues across the majority of the East Coast. And the Canadian provinces experiencing some of the worst wildfire seasons in recent memory is largely due to the fact that we've had such these highly anomalous high temperature patterns in the winter months that just don't do too good of a job in creating too much vegetation into the Canadian prairie regions and the forests subsequently. So hopefully we can get some of this air that is currently over Greenland and Alaska to make its way down here. I might have a theory about some ways that could happen that I'll explain later down the road. But ultimately, this is not as good news as it sounds in terms of having such nice mild temperatures here in the plains. That is, the bill will eventually become due, if that keeps itself up the majority of the winter months. But one of the things that I definitely wanted to take a look at was I was looking at some of these flights that were coming in across the Pacific Ocean due to our storm system, and this is a flight that is currently on its way from Seoul, South Korea, going all the way to Atlanta. And you can see that its typical projected flight path actually took it over the majority of the Japanese archipelago, going through under the Yakutsk Peninsula, over the near the Aleutians, and then coming back down before making its way over the San Francisco Bay Area. But it actually, and they do that just because, due to the curvature of the Earth, it's technically a shorter distance to go that particular way than it is to go the quote-unquote long way, which could go a straight line on a Cartesian plane Mercator map, such as this one. But they chose to go that way, and you can see actually that they've evened out their speed. So originally they had a speed that was going well over 750 miles an hour, and had planned for 558, still going very, very fast over that course of time. So it ended up going a lot faster by going on this southern route, and obviously there's a reason behind that, and it's this North Pacific jet. The jet extension has currently made its way over into our particular region in the U.S. Ultimately, that is the cause. Excuse this. Ultimately, that is the cause of this giant atmospheric river pattern that we are experiencing, and the wind speeds up in this particular region right in here are going over 200 miles an hour. So all that the plane has to do is just get in this jet stream at about 7 miles up in the atmosphere, and ultimately it gets a 200 mile an hour wind boost for free. So it's an interesting little tidbit that you end up you go a lot bit faster by incorporating some of these upper level meteorological conditions. And, that's, instead of going over land, you go over a large portion of the sea, and you end up going faster, even if it's a lower latitude region. So it's kind of an interesting little thing. So this is, once again, up in the upper levels. So they were looking at the North Pacific upper level jet. Currently, we see that the majority of the jet is extending off into this eastern portion of the Pacific, which impacts the United States greatly, as we get a lot of diffluent and divergent flow out over the left exit region of this particular jet. And if you haven't been here before, when we explain geostrophic flow, essentially when you cut a big upper level jet stream like this into quarters, the left exit region, which, if the flow is going in this general direction, the left exit region of flow would be right here. We'll denote that with this circle. In this particular region, we understand that to be diffluent flow because there is a void that it's creating in the upper atmosphere. Specifically, you see the flow right here is going in a bunch of different directions, kind of like a water spout almost. And whenever that occurs, that means that the air is essentially pulling in air from the surface. And if air is pulling from the surface relative to the upper levels of the atmosphere, you could then say that air is rising, which is exactly the type of convective motion we would need to promote, rain or thunderstorms or any kind of weather at all. So we see that is currently playing out, and actually in that same process, the end result is a low pressure center gets formed in that kind of eddy right there, and that is ultimately where we would expect to see a consistent surface level low to form as this goes over the Rocky Mountain plateaus. And here it's experiencing a little bit of a unique setup here because we have a kind of a weak high over low pattern here over the Rockies that is ultimately working to block some of that energy from getting over and into the Central Plains, and is pushing a lot of that moisture up further and further up into Canada. And as you know, this is a purely subtropical jet, so very warm and moist air. That is ultimately what is contributing to our warmer temperatures and moisture conditions in the Canadian prairie, which is what we just which is what we looked at just a few seconds ago here. So that is essentially what is happening here. As we go forward in time, we'll see that this eventually starts to make that particular region of difluent flow, this particular one right in here, starts to move a little bit further to the south and the east. And as that happens, we would expect to see more precipitation events to occur, and then over the southern portions of the Mountain West. And then if we move even further forward in time, we'll see that the jet extension starts to push even further and further into the United States. And particularly, we start to see some of that difluent flow occur here in the Central Plains, which might, it could lend itself to more of a severe threat for for Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas as we go forward into the latter portions of the weekend. So generally speaking, that is kind of what we're expecting with the North Pacific Jet, but as it stands right this moment, the Pineapple Express is in full effect, and the upper level jet pattern by jet extension from the North Pacific Jet is ultimately the main driver that is drawing in. And as we just talked about, we would expect a low pressure center to form, and I meant to show this to you. So we expect the low pressure center to be right here at the surface, and ultimately that is what we are seeing. So we see that this is what the cloud formation looks like. We see the ultimate Pineapple Express moisture band make its way to the west coast down there. So that is ultimately what we're seeing. So we're going to take a look at the model guidance. This is how the models have performed in terms of accuracy over the past couple of days, and this has kind of been like a little bit of a trend. So you can see that the model accuracy denoted in blue would be the Euro, and the model accuracy depicted in red is the GFS. Generally speaking, the Euro has won out in the majority of all these days, but you can see that the models tend to break down. And what was going on here at the beginning of the year, end of the year last year, was we had that major cold snap, right? So we had freezing temperatures throughout. We had a disruption of the polar vortex. We had all kinds of stuff going on at this particular moment when both the Euro and the GFS kind of went awry, and we can see that a similar motion is starting to occur here with both of the models now. So I'm just kind of going to put some pieces together that might show that our current pattern might be in the very early stages of starting to break down and beginning maybe to start to give us a little bit of a notion that cold air might be returning. But first, we're going to take a look at what the Euro and the GFS are expecting here over the next couple of days. So we do see that atmospheric river making its way off into the Cascadian Plateau, and we see a lot of those moisture bands are making its way over into the Pacific Northwest, moving it forward a little bit more further in time. We can see that low center starts to meander and make its primary, and you see the upper level jet flow starts to make its way over the Mountain West like we anticipated. Higher elevations will get some snow out of this, but importantly, a lot of Arizona, New Mexico, and the Four Corner states will get some precipitation before that low pressure center breaks off and starts to form a new leeward low over the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas, and starts to begin a little bit more of that meridional flow, which would ultimately kind of go like this. It would be a negatively tilted trough, which is not really good news in terms of severe weather, because ultimately that's quite a bit of forcing that could be involved there if that pattern remains to be the case. We can take a look at the convective available models on Friday when this system is going to be a little bit more easier to see. But that's ultimately the next, I would anticipate, severe weather outbreak here in the States. Then we get kind of like at this little stationary boundary before that low starts to make its way over and into the southeast. Next rainmaker event for the southeast would definitely be on the latter portions of the weekend and into the work week next week. Before it starts to, and there's a little bit of discrepancy on timing. GFS is a little fast, Euro's a little bit slower, but one of the things that is interesting is that this low forms off of the Carolina coast here and perhaps starts to strengthen a little bit, and could contribute to some gale force winds off the southern eastern tier, which would be interesting to see around this time of year. It just kind of adds to the kind of craziness of the of the season. If it's going to be that warm and moist, those kind of systems would technically they would have a place off the East Coast should they form. So both of them are in that kind of manner of speaking before we get the second round of atmospheric river moisture start to make its way into California the next week. And then there's just pretty significant discrepancy from that point on. So that's the kind of the main features would be the atmospheric river that we're experiencing right now over the West Coast, which would go over the desert, the Mountain West, and into the desert Southwest before our first severe threat into next week starts to make its presence known. And we can see that actually modeled in the Day 3 outlook, that severe threat, marginal risk from the SPC across the majority of central Texas. And you can see that they're saying it's a highly diffluent flow regime coupled with the ejection of the primary shortwave impulse across New Mexico. Peak heating thunderstorms along the Pacific cold front and the dry line. This is all stuff that would be very typical for this El Nino atmospheric river event that we're experiencing here in the States. In terms of signs that the cold might be making its way back, what we need, this is the MJO index, the Madden-Julian oscillation. Essentially, it just tracks this big blob of tropical moisture that makes its way around the globe in a 30 to 60 day time scale, typically. It's particularly enhanced by El Nino in the winter, so this is kind of the time that we would definitely want to pay attention to it. And any time that it is here in the phases 6 and 7 here in the Western Pacific, just kind of like right before the international date line, it's kind of like right on the cusp. And in terms of impacts for the United States, generally speaking, here in the Southeast, when it's in phase 7 like this, and there's a lot of ambiguity about where it's going to be, but generally the ensembles are saying it's going to stay in phase 7 for the foreseeable future here in the next week or so. Ultimately, it lends itself to more drier conditions, more milder air, and that's definitely something that we've experienced. But generally, if we would expect that the oscillation to start moving into the Western Hemisphere and back and over into phase 1, which restarts over Central Africa. And when that happens, we would expect a whole lot more in terms of disturbances over the contiguous U.S. Ultimately, this leads to a disruption of the polar vortex. You get sudden stratospheric warming events, which some research has indicated has a connection with the MJO. It just kind of it messes things up, and ultimately, anytime we mess things up with that overall polar flow is when the continental parts of the United States experience big fluctuations in temperature, specifically in the winter and an El Nino year. They can get quite cold, and this exact scenario is what happened last month, as we saw in the anomaly correlation here between in accuracy between the flagship models. This was generally right here was when the MJO moved from phase 7 to phase 8, and ultimately the polar vortex started to become a lot more disorganized. Major stratospheric low formed over the Bering Strait and started to jettison a lot of Arctic air down into the North American subcontinent. So if history is an indicator, and if by history I mean 30 days ago, that is something to be expected, I would say. Another thing to look at is the Arctic oscillation. This is a oscillation that occurs and essentially tracks. Essentially, what it means is whenever this index, it's a numerical unitless index. Whenever it goes positive, you can expect that the majority of the cold and dry air will stay in the higher latitudes, the more northern latitudes near the Arctic Ocean. And anytime it comes and goes further below and into the negative index, that's when you'd expect for that cold air to make its way down further south. And you can see right now it's a very, very strong connection right now. A 3 on the index for the Arctic oscillation is very, very indicative that there is all the cold and dry air is pretty much contained in the Arctic Circle and maybe the northern portions of Siberia. But the ensemble forecasts are saying that it's going to take a pretty drastic dip down towards, and by the time we get to the mid portions of February, there is a good indicator that that we're going to see some more cold air here in the United States. And you can see there's two other main portions of the winter that have experienced that cold air. Once was around Thanksgiving, or the week after Thanksgiving, which I remember to be quite cold, and especially towards the end of Christmas. The last week of the year is when things started to turn for the worse temperature-wise here in the States. And that seems to be the model forecast for the Arctic Oscillation, so that's something to keep in mind for sure. And as far as like synoptically what to look for, so we see this is the upper level pattern according to the Euro. We see that upper level jet extension make its way over and into the southern tier of the U.S., and then it starts to make its way, creates that difluent flow over the central states, creating that severe weather threat into Sunday and Monday. Interesting little upper level low setup that it has over the southeast. We definitely have to make sure to keep an eye on that as we go forward next week. And then that new low starts to form in the same place. We'll probably have another atmospheric river event. And these are very common. Like, I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's 3 consecutive atmospheric river events. It's just how the current pattern is. California experienced the same exact thing last year. So it's nothing that is game breaking by any means, but it is certainly something to keep an eye on. The interesting thing that I am definitely looking at is this particular ridge that will form here once it loads fully here. So you see a good amount of this bulge right in here. This is high pressure ridging that is trying to make its way and force itself into Canada. Now, Canada, as we talked about earlier, is very, very, very cold right now. Very cold. There are people that live up in Anchorage, Alaska. They've experienced over 100 inches of snow, and they haven't seen. They see only 3 hours of daylight a day from the sun. It's been a pretty miserable winter for most of our Aleutian friends. But ultimately, it's been pretty darn cold up there, and all the cold air has been generally trapped in this region. And the only way that it's ever going to get dislodged is if we have this Arctic Oscillation, Madden-Julian, those indexes, and ultimately they're all showing this. What would need to happen to displace it is we need a high pressure ridge such as this one to kind of bully itself up and into Alaska to displace the cold air and move it over into the Canadian prairie. And ultimately, how high pressure works is if there were a high pressure ridge in this particular situation. So let's say the high pressure forms right here. That high pressure would advect air from that region and kind of work it like this. It would bisect the Rocky Mountains here, and that flow would actually get diverted up and into the central plains. So ultimately, that cold air that sits over Alaska naturally just kind of flows into the rest of the United States by way of high pressure that would sit over right in that region. And ultimately, that is going to be the main driver for any kind of cold that we see here with this particular pattern coming up. We need that high pressure ridge to build if we are ever going to displace that cold air necessary to get it to move out of Alaska and down and in to the contiguous U.S. with enough cold air advection forcing in order to actually transport it down into the contiguous U.S. But the problem also is that the longer that we sit under warm conditions like this, the more the soil warms up, and the harder the atmosphere ultimately is going to be in order to modify and change back into cold. So kind of like the sooner this can happen, the better, because I know there are some areas that are already being impacted in terms of planting. I know some daffodils are coming up across the southeast already. I mean, our trees are starting to bloom in some of the southern portions of the states. I mean, like, it can have a pretty devastating effect on agriculture and local foliage if these typical patterns don't kind of self-correct themselves. So we'll move forward and to see maybe some reflection of that cold air. So we see that highly anomalous air in the highly anomalously warm air over the eastern portions of the United States. 50s in Minnesota and Iowa and Nebraska. That's ridiculous this time of year. But over time, we move forward into Sunday, Monday. Those reds and deep yellows, or deep reds and browns, start to become less and less of a factor, and we might start to see a little bit more of that cold air start to move in. starting in the beginnings of next week. But that's not the best teleconnection to really show that. This is all preliminary. That's the first thing I would kind of look at, is if Montana and North Dakota start to make its way back down into the 20s for this particular map. And maybe we can look at this. This is a much better reasoning. So this is the Euro ensemble going forward. See those atmospheric rivers come in, and ultimately we'll get to the very end of the guidance period here. Yeah, so this is actually a really good thing. So we see the cold air starting on Saturday here is very much lodged in that Aleutian area over central Alaska and the northern territories of Canada. And then we can see as a high pressure ridge starts to build in behind it, it gets displaced and pushed over the Canadian prairie. Now, the fact that it's showing that in an ensemble format for a 144 hours out, I think that's a pretty good positive sign that if this pattern stays, and maybe if we can get high pressure to sit over Greenland as well to displace that air, that's a pretty good indicator that mid-February, post Valentine's Day, could start to see some more frigid temperatures here in the contiguous U.S. But this is all just kind of like preliminary thinkings and thoughts. We have a long time in between to get that. This is over a week out. So as we all know in meteorology, it's the science in which chaos theory was originally born from. It was meteorology, and this stuff can change on a dime. So at least that's what I'm looking at. Those are the connections that at least I'm seeing, that perhaps we could see some more cold air come in starting into the middle part of the month, maybe a little later. But ultimately, it's just something more to keep an eye on, and ultimately just trying to I'm personally very worried about the wildfire threat. I would not like a continuous smoky summer based off of the conflagrations going on from our northern neighbors. But that's just the name of the game here in kind of this in this climatological world. So folks, that kind of does it for me today. I appreciate you tuning in. Once again, this has been Great Atmosphere. My name is Zach. I do these videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, particularly pertaining to the Southeast, except on days like today when the weather is kind of, I'm not going to say boring by any means, but it's certainly not a lot to talk about. And we'll start to take a look at some other more interesting things around in the northern subcontinent region. I appreciate you tuning in, and I'll see you again on Friday for another video. Take care.